think I've always used photography as a tool in my creative processes. I started working in the film industry, first in sound and then in film editing, and I learnt to love that craft of putting things together technically. I was very passionate about the rhythm of in a frame when it's sort of moving through a projector and so on and so forth. And I was just fascinated by the whole craft of all the people involved in bringing a film together. After I left the Australian Film, Television, Radio School, then I decided I wanted to create my own source material. So I had a vision of creating a story that I could edit myself, and so the camera's always been a tool for the way I've seen the world, and likewise in explorations for feature film work I've always had the camera with me, looking for locations or exploring sort of ideas. It's a tool for seeing, and it's deeper than that. It's a way of investigating into relationships with subjectivity. I think I probably use it more poetically now, in that the relationship between the subject and the camera. The show here at the Vivian, my show is called Subject to Consent, and the key image is one I took of a young woman called Nicole in 2018, looking at subjectivity and the relationship between the photographer and the subject, and looking at the kind of ethical boundaries that I think need to be considered in that process. And Nicole in particular, I sort of is an interesting example of sort of handing over agency to the subject. So rather than taking control and saying, you know, why don't you stand here and I'm going to have the camera here, and having a kind of very formal, controlling relationship with the subject, I wanted to sort of hand over those kind of traditional powers that a photographer might have and see what evolved in a process of exploration that was more dynamic. So Nicole chose, you know, when we shot, which was after work, and where we shot, which was the Snells Beach car park. And it was very dark and dingy, so there was sort of no lighting apart from what was ambient from passing cars and the shops around the place. And I was really interested in that technically, because that put me sort of on my back foot, if you like, but it also gave things the most amazing kind of texture, because obviously I had to bump the ISO up on the camera and things like that. So what it did is give me this treasure trove of a particular kind of feeling. By not controlling it, I was able to kind of just explore those moments for what they had in themselves that was kind of different from what you might expect. And I was very interested in the way that perhaps being in front of the camera, there's a sort of self-consciousness that sort of flows, and there's a point where that kind of disappears, and that idea of just getting the moment right disappears, and it becomes about just being. And I'm very interested in that idea of being and time flowing, and some of my other work, which it's the same kind of thing I'm exploring in some of the landscapes, is just being in a space and seeing what reveals itself. So whether it's people or landscapes, that the effect that time has and the effect of looking and seeing. And I'm very interested in the ordinary as opposed to the extraordinary. So I'm not looking for performance when it's people, and I'm not looking for majestic light and majestic sort of icons to photograph, but very much the unseen, the simple, the everyday. The image of John, which I've called Living, sat with me for probably a couple of years, and I guess I took it in some ways as an archive of the fact that here he was home, and it was sort of hard to believe, quite soon after he left hospital. And then I just sort of shut that book and only opened it again recently, so it was very strange now to sit with it and realise it's taken on some more of a sort of metaphorical kind of significance. I think that the work in this show is way more personal than what I've looked at before, and I think that's an example of that. It's a very simple photograph, but there's an incredible defiance in his demeanour, and there's a lot about life and death in all of the images, and that idea of time and how it imprints itself upon us, and you can see that in the flowers as well. The sense of this, the photographer with this relationship or feeling of the density of time, and how, it's here 1 minute and there it's gone. It's a bit of a cliche to say that, but it's like exploring the feeling motivated to take a photograph. It's trying to sit with the feelings and seeing, do I feel like taking this, and why, and what am I expressing, and what am I looking at, and why am I looking at that? So those are the kinds of motivations, and they're not really technical motivations like they used to be, because a lot of the photographs in the show embrace a kind of distorted kind of technical world, but they have more emotional kind of cut through, I think. So the image of Jack, he was 13, and I actually set up the back of my truck with a wee photography studio, and I travelled taking portraits of people at horse shows, and I spontaneously asked him if he would like me to take his photograph, and he was very keen for that to happen. And there was just a moment where he prepared himself for the photograph, and then that fell away, and that was just a moment that I loved and captured. I think, you really do see that transitional state of that time and his age, and the vulnerability of that moment of sort of standing up and wanting to be kind of counted, and then just that sense of sort of being in the eye of the camera. What I get out of photographing is engaging with the world. So I've been sort of perhaps writing a screenplay at home, and I'll just be sitting with my computer, and as soon as I go out and photograph, it really doesn't matter what I'm photographing, I just feel engaged and happy. It's like it. The other thing that just constantly surprises me is when I feel like I've seen something and I photograph it. I feel like sometimes I've underestimated what I've been looking at, and I look at the image and I go, oh, I just didn't spend long enough with that. So even though they might be more documentary style things, they start that when you acknowledge an object or you look at a landscape in a particular way through the camera, all of a sudden it starts to come into existence as an object. So in particular, when working with people, I notice a transformation. So I notice that people actually enjoy being photographed when there's not a pressure to perform in any way, but when what is going on between the camera and the subject is kind of a dynamic kind of give and take, and that's what I'm interested in, is sort of not really owning it, but participating in the relationship that photographing gives you. So I think that's a key thing for me.